Hello, this is FRJH Racing, and this is a video in response to the current state of Robocraft and the boost systems that really need to go. I put together this little mini game, and it's going to be displaying a lot of things on how I wish to see the movement work in Robocraft. And I mean, myself, I've never really developed a game before, but my actual profession is an engineer, and I've done a little bit of coding. So I've actually put this together from an engineering background, and also in response to having individual assets that can just scale and work together, kind of like how when you place like a wheel in Robocraft, you can put another one and another one, and it'll always work. You won't have to go in and set anything. Well, the same thing happens here, and I'll just kind of show that off right now. I can change a lot of these variables at runtime, and I can also scale this just taking these assets right here, the wheel steering. I've written this script in a way such that it looks at where these wheels are in relation to the center of mass and sets them up appropriately so you don't have like rear steering wheels unless you want to. But I haven't gotten this working yet, so that's the only thing that doesn't work on this. However, we don't really need that for this explanation. What I'll also be doing in this video is to explain the whole scale thing that you may have heard me mention in another video, my physics video. And this will reinforce it. And I really need to hear me out in this entire process, because there's a couple things that are very technical in this, and I'm going to try to simplify as much as possible using this as kind of a model to show you firsthand what I'm talking about. So the first thing is that I think the speed boost system needs to go, and that it needs to be replaced with power and force. So let's derive these things that I'm talking about. Force is mass times acceleration. So if you have some force, usually in newtons or some other force value, then you have your mass of what you're trying to move, and therefore you can derive its acceleration. You can also have the acceleration, the mass of something can tell you what force is inflicted on it. So that's the first equation. You also have power equals work over time. And we'll explain this with the other following equation, that work itself is the force, and the distance that is actually the force is done over. So if you do this much force over this much distance, say you lift up a dumbbell to some waist level, you've done so much work, and when you put it back down, the net work is back at zero. Next thing is power and force, or power is force times distance over time. So then you can see clearly that power is also work over time, like I said before. So when you have distance over time, that's also velocity. That's a derivative, a time derivative of distance is velocity. And what's not shown on here is that acceleration is a time derivative of velocity. So if you have velocity, a time derivative of distance, and acceleration, a time derivative of velocity, you can derive all these things in a physics engine like Unity. So I built this little game example in Unity because that's what FreeJam uses. And if I can do this, then I'm most certainly that the coders there can do it. This took me about probably a couple days. It's been about 3 or 4 days of actually coding the logic behind how this works. And I've been kind of dabbling in Unity on other projects, but this is my first serious kind of display of how this all should work. The final thing is that we have power equals force times velocity. And then you can kind of change this around. Top speed equals power over force, or force equals power over top speed. Now, a real world example of this would be like a dynamometer, which measures engine output, like in your car. And what you'll typically see is you'll see some kind of horsepower rating at some RPM, which is really important. And then you'll also see a torque figure, which is like in Newton meters or foot-pounds if you're in the US. If you look at this, force times velocity, you have velocity as a rate of displacement. RPM is also a radial displacement over time. So if you have force for a radial setup, you actually have torque. So torque's a rotational force, And RPM is a rotational velocity, and therefore you can still get power from it. There's also a conversion factor if you're using a dynamometer, like power equals force, or power equals torque times RPM over 5252. That's how you derive engine output. However, going into speed boost and how Robocraft would work, or how I wish it to be, is that you set a power and a force setting to all parts, and then you can derive top speed from that. So you would say that this wheel has like 200 power and it can output this much torque or force. It's interchangeable depending on if it's a rotating item or a linear force kind of thing, like a thruster. So taking that into account, we'll move on to how this will work in the game and kind of showing you how you implement it and how it kind of feels. Hopefully this kind of, you'll see what I'm talking about once this thing starts moving. Let's say I have, this should really be force, but I haven't renamed it because I'd have to go through my code. But this is actually the force out. And so if I set this up really high and we go back to here, I can get force and then my top speed, which is what I'm going to set here, to get power. Notice that as my top speed that I set is higher and the force that I set is higher, that my power is lower, and vice versa, because when you're trying to exert more force over more of a rate, then you of course need more power to do that. So all these things are interchangeable. So let's set this to 10, and we have the force rating actually pretty high for this. But as you can see, it hits 10 and it just kind of stops. We're accelerating. We can start ramping that up a little more. And there you go. Now we're at 20. This is actually how speed boost works. When you put something that has some base speed and then you have parts that add speed boost, it comes up with some top speed setting. And then what I have is a control loop in my code that says if it's going faster than this, stop giving a force, or to make it so it's not jerky, put a little bit less force. And then that control loop keeps switching on and off the force. So as you can see here, it'll get to 20 and then it'll stop accelerating. Also, I put an artificial limit on acceleration. If you remember from a physics video, that things accelerate way too fast, almost 9 Gs, that the game feels like very twitchy and also slow. But that's also a byproduct of scale, which I'll show also with this example. So the problem with that is that when things are real scale like this, and you have insane accelerations, then things start getting jerky, and actually the game might crash because any of your physics items might become unstable. It also does other things that I don't really want to get into. But at the end of the day, you really need to limit acceleration. And remember how I said acceleration is a time derivative of speed. So I actually derived this by doing a frame-by-frame iteration of setting what your speed is, doing a frame delta time, and then measuring the speed difference over that frame limit. And you can smooth that out by actually adding more frames. So I can bring the code up here where it does that. And yes, I coded this all myself, so it might be messy, but I try to keep it organized. And as you can see here, this is a smoothed out acceleration, and then this is real-time acceleration. The importance of that is that the physics engine needs that real-time acceleration, but when it's displayed, it could be really jerky and you can't really make it out when you're trying to read it from here. So this is the smoothed out acceleration. As you can see, these numbers are just going crazy, and this one's just kind of changing every half second, 60 frames per second. I did it for 30. So if you are looking at this, you can see the acceleration's limited, which you can also do in any game built in Unity. You can set a force value, and if you don't want to like just balance all your forces and you are running into some physics engine problems with how the game's coded on Robocraft's end, that does not allow you to fine-tune force, then you can just set a control loop like speed boost does. And what I've done here is the same thing for top speed. When it reaches top speed, it gives a force, and then when it reaches a certain acceleration, you can set this really high. It's like, remember, this is a force. I kind of misnamed it, which is inappropriate for this, but this is actually going to be a force value, so don't confuse that. You can kind of see here that if I do that again, the acceleration does go pretty high, but that's because at that frame it's actually evaluating a conditional statement. But if you look in the game, you don't really have that jerkiness as if let's go in reverse, because I didn't code it for reverse. So as you can see, it just goes some insane acceleration. But if we're going forward, this is jerking around because that's where the force is exerted. But that can be smoothed out in other ways. The point is that you can limit acceleration, you can limit top speed by just doing a control loop. So the next thing I want to show is that you can kind of play around with the force and the top speed to get, like, actually the performance that you want from a certain part. However, what's not shown here, and I could just code it in, but I haven't, is that if there's a power rating and it has a force rating, then it can also have an associated top speed. But when you start combining different parts, you would actually have a running average of this. So what that would look like as your top speed, you would have power plus in power, and what I mean by that is like another part that has a power rating, and then you would have that all divided by force 1 and then force 2 plus blah blah blah, and you would have that continue on for however many movement parts you have. And as you can see here, if you were to run this with many different parts, that it would be a running average of those parts, and then you would get some kind of top speed. So let's say I put this in, I just had 80,000 for my force, and I want my top speed, let's make it 80. My running average of force, or power over force, would have to be and there you go. 64,000 would be the power rating, and then you would have some kind of force rating. And these two things would be on every movement part, and you would get some top speed from that. So then, if you look into this more, let's say we had another 40,000 power thing with the same amount of force. So then if we add those together, you would have like 104,000. And you doubled this, you would have 160. So then now you would have double the force, and depending on your mass, you would have so much more acceleration. And then also you would be given actually a lower speed, because the amount of power that other part had has actually lowered your the rate at which you can deliver all the forces combined. So then using this kind of logic, you can define a top speed, and you can have some kind of force that's called 80,000. And then as you can see, there's still an acceleration limit because of the mass that I set, just for realism, so this thing doesn't explode. But ideally the mass would be balanced across all the parts, that the force, the mass, and the acceleration would be kind of in line with non-insane values like this. And as you can see, it has no problem accelerating up to that speed, to 60. So if we look at that, that's how much? 134 miles per hour. Not bad. And actually, if you look at this example, it looks that fast. If you're actually playing this in a game, you would this actually looks like it's going really fast, and it feels like it's going fast. And that's a byproduct of me having a realistic scale and a realistic speed that you would expect from this. Also, acceleration's been managed so that it doesn't just zoom off into space. Now, let me scale this up like it is in Robocraft. As I explained in that video, the scaling that I think it is about 3 to 6. So let's take something in between that. Let's take 5. And let's set that same speed and force value. So if I put 60 in and I make this, it still accelerates the same, but look how much slower it looks. And this is what I'm getting at with Robocraft, is that things are so big that 300 miles per hour is like nothing. And you can see this thing's like going away with, like, the forces are just going crazy on that because of how I set it up. Again, I could smooth it out, but I haven't had the time to do that. But again, looking at this, it doesn't really look like it's going that fast. And also it's very floaty. Notice when I hit the brakes, it just kind of like, it kind of bounced around, and it didn't really seem like it had a lot of, like, look at that. That felt really slow. And that's what I was getting at in Robocraft, is that even though they've increased the acceleration of gravity, which is 9.81 meters per second realism, they probably have it to some kind of value. I think someone derived it before, around 30 or 40. And that's also in line with my scale thing that I've talked about. It's about a 3 or 4 scale, but that's only for your vertical component. You also have a byproduct of that, is that the tolerances in the physics engine, when things are moving, have to travel a greater distance. And if you have any kind of error checking, like crawler legs, to see if you're attached to a collider, it's moving many, many, many units more than if it was a true scale or if it was a smaller scale. However, so what I'm getting at is, if you've ever talked to me in chat or anything, you might have heard me say that it's impossible to fix crawler legs to make them stick on the walls, or just completely go nuts. It's impossible to fix it in the current scale in Robocraft because of how big it is. And how they've counteracted that is that while also making things insanely huge, they've also made them very fast. So let me put this back to, it's still this scale, and let's put it to 300 miles per hour. That's what my car goes in Robocraft, and that's 134 in the game, based on the scaling that I have. And we'll see if we can get moving. But mind you, I've limited my acceleration to 1G. So we'll eventually get to that speed, but notice how the acceleration feels a lot more gradual. And that's a byproduct of how I've coded this, and my intent that we really need to manage acceleration in the game too. Because if we had instant acceleration, then it would just go completely nuts. And that's what we have in Robocraft, is things go from 0 to top speed in no time at all. So again, let's set the 134 meters per second, which is almost the speed of one of my cars in game. And this is about the scale that you'll see in Robocraft. And we'll set the acceleration to 80,000. And I'll also increase the damping because I don't want the suspension to go completely crazy. So let's see how this goes. Let's do that. There we go. Again, this is still 1/3 the acceleration that you see in Robocraft. And we're gradually getting up to that top speed of 300 miles per hour. And this will continue to accelerate until it reaches that top speed. But again, that's 300 miles per hour. Let's make this full screen. Would you say this looks like it's approaching 300 miles per hour? I mean, from my point of view, it doesn't look like that at all. Not even close. I mean, if you look at the ground, yes. Since I haven't changed the scale of the grid pattern. But again, that's not actually what 300 miles per hour looks like. if you're to play like another racing game. And that's how I caught up. That's how I kind of caught on so quick, is that they are using really huge scale to run their game. And the reason why, there's many other things that actually make it easier to code physics when the things are bigger. First of all, you'll see when I scale this down and try to run it at 300 miles per hour, it may explode because the tolerances are so tight in true scale when you're moving that fast that the relative velocities are so much quicker. So when something rotates, or if anything has to move in respect to another thing, the relative velocities are insane. However, when I scaled this up 4 times, all those relative velocities have that magnitude difference between, say, if there's some kind of rotation around a point. For example, when this is true scale and I go to drift, I have a force that makes it drift a little bit better. And as I scale it up, even though the masses and everything else is the same, because the arm that the torque is acting on, which is your force times distance is your torque, by a longer arm, and I have the same force, inertia cannot be changed as much. So even though your acceleration might be more, your velocities might be less. So it kind of has this trade-off of, when you scale it up, you have a couple things going on there. Another thing that it allows is that because those relative velocities go over such a larger distance, and your distance can be evaluated over more space, that means your error can be bigger. So when you look at camera controls and how they work, when they need to rotate and follow a certain target, it can follow that target much easier because your error is much bigger. So like when you have that control loop of it rotating and it's trying to look at some point that the camera's looking at, it's going to say turn left, turn right very quickly, and the physics engine's handling that. It's doing some kind of torque. However, because that relative distance is so much bigger, it's scaled up 4 or 5 times, it has more of a distance to travel before it has to do a compensation, before it needs to go the other way. So when it scales up, it actually makes that error bigger, and you can have your control loop a lot more forgiving. It's not going to be as jerky, and it smooths things out. So that's actually the benefit of having such a huge scale. However, you can still get the same effect by managing your forces, such as I have in my control loop. Put this back to true scale, and let's run this at the same force and the same top speed and watch what happens. It might explode, it might crash the game. But if you want to see 300 miles per hour, you're going to see it here. And there you go. It's still approaching 134, and the acceleration's trying to get you there. But we might need some more force to do it. It'll get a little more crazy. Still, it might crash, but look at that speed go up. Oh man. Yeah, we've broken it. That's what 134 miles per hour looks like. And we didn't even get there yet. We were going 300 miles per hour. We're probably going a little bit over 200. But that's without any downforce or anything. That's why the thing just flew in the air and completely went crazy. So this is why I advocate for scaling down the game, making the speeds a little bit more manageable, or actually keeping them the same. Because right now the top speed in the game is 60 miles per hour with how it feels now. And that feels really, if you look at it in true scale. Let's do this in 60 miles per hour. What is that? 26. So let's set the top speed to 26, because this will simulate the really high force values that you see in the game, even though the 1G limit will probably take over. But here we go. And we're already there. This is what the game feels like right now, is that even if you limit acceleration to 1G, the top speeds still go completely out the wall. So this is actually what the game feels like now. Just a really nice, leisurely 26 meters per second, which is 60 miles per hour. So let's put this maximized, and would you say this is what a 300 mile per hour vehicle feels like in the game? And in my opinion, I feel like this is really close. I'll actually put a little video up here next to it showing my car going 300, and I'll let you be the judge to see if it's about the same kind of feel. So they can still get away with that. As you can see, lowering the velocities, showing true velocities, and also managing forces, managing power, and managing top speed. All this can be done with power and force, and if you use this right here, you can do a running average of all the power of all the parts and all the forces of all the parts. So if you mix thrusters and other things that might have a different power over force ratio, then you can get other effects, like something that accelerates really fast and something that might not go that fast, or vice versa, something that can go really, really fast, has a lot of power, but not that much force at all, so it accelerates it really slowly. Mind you, everything I've been talking up to now is kind of in context of how our power supply works, because I'm talking about top speed. I'm not talking about the add complexity to the proposition. Now, with that, you'll also have a situation where, let's say you're falling in Robocraft right now. When you have a speed boost setting, it's one setting. It only goes to that top speed, and if you're falling or you're rising, it's still going to be that top speed. Now, what can be put into this is, let's say you're falling, right? And you have some force that is allowing you to go down. However, what is also there is that you have a negative force from gravity. And the only time this is true is as you approach vertical. So let's say you're going completely 90 degrees straight towards the ground. You would have the force, which would be acceleration 9.81 times the mass of your bot, and that would be in subtraction to the forces of all your parts. What this is saying is that it takes this much less force, or this much less force is delivered at this power. So if your power is the same and your force is now less, because it's your force output minus the gravitational force equals some lower force, then you have a greater top speed. So then you can actually, by falling, you can have a higher top speed. You're not just locked in to whatever the power over force equation says. It'll look at if you're going up or you're going down. The same things can be defined for the power and force, can be defined for strafing and other axes. However, in my case for the car, it was purely forward and back. In the same way that speed boost calculates speed boost in all axes. I've actually done another video on this with my roll rockets, that the one that's displayed in the UI is your forward direction speed boost. There's a speed boost for your left and right, up and down, and backwards as well, which is not displayed. There's 5 other speed boosts that are summed up that you need to calculate yourself. There's also some parts that don't put that speed boost on all axes. For example, a wheel will do your speed boost in forward and backwards direction, and left and right is just some arbitrary value of how the steering works. A copter will strafe left and right, forward and back at some speed, and have its own speed boost with its base speed. So all these things have to be considered, and that your power and force will generally be for the forward and back motion, or what axis it's facing. So this calculation has to be done for every axis, or every major axis, up and down, left and right, and forward and back. So when you look at that, that's how the system will work, and the scaling will have to be fixed. as well as you'd have to rebalance the forces and rebalance the mass of parts, because at the end of the day, we don't have a really good mass system. Just when I thought I couldn't get surprised anymore, I just noticed they changed the units because I took off all my speedometers. And now the car that went 300 before, assuming they didn't really change anything, it didn't really feel any different. Now it goes 270 kilometers per hour. Mind you, it went 300 miles per hour before. So if that wasn't enough for you to know that the scaling is completely arbitrary, remember that what I perceived as when I did the other relative scale in my physics video was 60 miles per hour. And as you can see here, if you do 60 times 3, you would have gotten 180. So actually we're saying 3. So you're not fooling anyone. I've already evaluated this once. But now they've just changed the scale a little bit. And as like I was saying in the other video, in actuality we're going 60 miles per hour. It would be nice to go 120 or 100 and something. But we're not. They're just showing a big number in hopes that you won't notice. Because I can definitely tell you it doesn't look like 167 miles per hour. What it actually looks like is 60 miles per hour. So I hope you've learned something from all this and can get on board. So if you have any questions or concerns with any of the concepts I talked about here, just leave a comment, like and subscribe, and I hope we can make a better Robocraft.